I trained in printed textile design, surface pattern, and then printed textile design, specifically screen printing. I then worked for kind of high-end textile fabric fashion designers based in Wales for 3 years, and I did all their printing and dyeing. And then I set up my own studio and worked as a commercial textile designer for a little while through an agency. And then I got into lecturing, had a child. And I was thinking earlier how pivotal that has been in how my practice has developed, because I'm a single mum, I've had no other backup. So I've had to teach, and teaching has been the mainstay of my practice for the last 20 years, really, because I've had no other choice. I had to earn money. I realized I was a pretty rubbish textile designer, a commercial textile designer, because I thought too much about things, and the number of designs you have to produce to be a successful commercial surface pattern designer, you know, you've got to do like, I don't know how many to be able to sell enough to make a living, and that just wasn't me. So I then set up I collaborated with Cardiff Met, who I used to lecture with, and had spin-out funding to set up a workshop and studio to try and support textile graduates, and I had a small textile gallery. And I also developed their digital print practice there on the large format printer, where I experimented with using recycled fabrics and things. And then I had a bit of a breakdown. I had a hideous relationship, didn't know what I was doing for a few years, and then went back to Swansea and did my master's in fine art, which is where my practice sort of, I realised what it was I wanted to do and be a lot more. So I'm going to kind of skip back about 18 years, and I was given a residency by Wales Arts International. Ooh, what was that? You okay?
Sorry, we don't see stuff.
I just say that we haven't got the images up.
Okay, you're only on the
just
first
a very
slide.
Tiny.
We are only on the first slide, so you haven't missed anything. I've been just talking up to that point. So, are we doing share screen? So on Zoom, check the share screen thing. And it says we're sharing. Can you see that?
Not yet.
They can't see that?
No.
What's on?
No, screen sharing's off. Yeah, it's back on, but not an image yet.
Can you see anything now?
Yeah, that's up now.
You can see Quebec?
Yes.
Cool.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. So prior to all that, before I guess we're looking at when are we talking now? 2006, 2005, I think this is. I had a residency through Wales Arts International to go and work for 3 months in the winter in Quebec City at a place called Medusa, and the print centre there, which was called Angoulême. So I had an apartment there. I took my daughter with me, and we spent 3 months in the freezing cold of Quebec City winter. But it was, quite an incredible experience to have access, 24-hour access to the print facilities. And I wasn't a fine art printer, you know, I was a screen printer. So it was all kind of quite new to me. And I had guidance from some fantastic printmakers there. And there I explored the idea of protection and landscape and being a mother. And also I was really interested in skin as our own landscape, and the scars and the changes in our bodies. And I know this is a while ago, before all the cancer stuff happened, but I was already interested in scarring and tissue. And so working out in the cold in Quebec, where they wrap their trees up and they protect their children, and everything's kind of wrapped and there's threads. And so my work there was about that. And also I was looking at I was working with an Inuit artist, and I was looking at the traditional techniques and materials and the skins and things that they use there, and the stitching. So that's a shot of the, I've got very few images of this with me, and I wanted to show more, but I realized they're all at home on some hard drive and the internet doesn't go back this far. So it's a bit minimal. But I wanted to show with this how my practice involves multiple layers and multiple processes. So it began with a 3-dimensional image of a wrapped form, which was made out of a thermoplastic material. So that's the bottom left image there. And that's been wrapped in this antique red linen thread. So I've always saved things and held on to things and wanted to reuse things and recycle. And the environmental side of me has always been kind of, since my 20s has been there, and I've been banging on about recycling, God knows what else, for about the last 30 years. But it hadn't really kind of come into my practice at this point, but I did always save things. So there's that initial image form that then became a digital image when I scanned it into the computer. So I was using Photoshop and things back then. That scanned image then was reprinted out to become a screen print, which is what's on the right-hand side. So that's a multiple screen print of that initial three-dimensional image, which has then been stitched into. That was then printed as a digital large format image and then etched into after. So there's kind of about 8 different processes going on. And then on the top left-hand side, there's an etching and a blind embossing that was made with fabrics of that same print. So I kind of like go back and forth between 3-dimensional, maybe lens-based, maybe screen printed, and using fabrics and dyes and different substrates and handmade papers and things. So again, that's that same image down the bottom of that body form with the threads and with dyes. A couple of images of a few different pieces of work that I undertook in, I suppose, sort of 10, 15 years ago, again, relating to body and scarring and journeys and mapping and deconstruction of objects. And I was starting to think about provenance of objects and things. So the top right image is my diaries when I was a teenager that I tore apart. I read them, I photographed them and scanned them, and then cut them up and remade a load of paper with them and turned them into other forms. And the left-hand side is, there's a film that you can watch that online. I didn't try and do it tonight because we probably wouldn't have managed to get it to play. But that's about domestic abuse and about scarring and body forms. And I did an animated piece that's stitched into a piece of felt, and then the journey of that animation. And that's kind of a mapping as well of my journey. So it's from Newport to Cardiff and the various places that I lived around the South Wales and the abuse actually that occurred there. So it's it's a bit of a harrowing piece, but it was very cathartic. And then on the bottom right, following my MA, which I'm going to come on to in a sec, I was interested in the provenance of objects and things that we use every day. So that was me looking at making my own lipstick from blood, which is kind of one of the things that would have originally been used as lipstick. And blood and body fluids and my own body feature quite heavily in a lot of my work. So 11 years ago, I went back to college and went to Swansea and did the Masters in Fine Art. At that time, they didn't have a textiles masters, but I wasn't really interested in doing textiles because I kind of felt like I knew what I was doing process-wise with that. So I chose to do fine art because I wanted to explore the processes and the thoughts that I had. And quite early on, I realized that what I needed to do was to start thinking about the sustainability issues that I was so concerned with, and the planet and environmentalism. And I decided to only make work with what I had in my life. We've got heavy hail happening here. If you can hear something in the background, can you still hear me? Is anybody there? Can you hear me? If anybody wants to unmute. Before I like carry on talking and think I'm talking to myself.
Yes.
You can hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool. Thank you. I
you.
just thought we might lose connection or something because it's
Yeah,
quite bad.
it's very loud at the moment. So yeah, just bear with us if you're having trouble hearing us.
Okay, so yeah, I decided I needed to be completely sustainable, and I committed to not buying anything new for the 2 years that I did my masters. And that was all fine with most things, and I could borrow materials and tools and things, but I was very interested in digital printmaking as well as traditional printmaking. And I could put recycled materials through recycled fabric through printmakers, but then I was stuck with the ink and realized that I was entirely dependent on Epsom, etc., and the system that they have to buy inks. So that got me thinking about what ink was and whether I would be able to actually make my own ink. Ideally to do digital printmaking, and that's still something I'm thinking of. But initially I decided to make one ink, which was gallatanic oak gall ink, which is a really historical traditional ink. And then that led me on to decided to make 5 black inks that you see when you buy black. So you have lamp black, ivory black, etc. So I combined that with some traditional like hawthorn and gallatanic. And my MA became about the process of gathering and collecting and documenting every single process and every single material that went into making that small bottle of ink. So on the right there, you can see the piece that went with the galvatanic. I'm going to have to put my glasses on there to be able to read that. So the galvatanic ink involved gathering, crushing, grinding, soaking, fermenting, heating and mixing. And it involved an oak tree, a wasp, some galls, some water, some vitriol, more water and gum arabic. And that's the people who assisted me by loaning me tools. So Rob Newell from Swansea lent me his muller because I didn't have one at that point. A farmer's daughter who got in touch with me sent me a whole bag of oat galls because I hadn't managed to find many at that point. So it was really about the entire process and how much went into making that small little bottle of ink. At the bottom there, you can see some digital images. That was an installation with the word unsustainable written across it, because to print those digital images, I'd had to rely on mineral ink. And I call that's the entire process sort of documented on the wall, which starts with a little acorn, which grows into an oak, which then gives you the tree that the wasp can land on, that forms a gall that you collect and you crush and you grind and you add water and iron and heat it, etc. So I was trying to visualize the process of making that ink. That's continued on since then, and I've sort of expanded that repertoire and learned a lot more, and ink making's become a kind of trendy thing all over Instagram. So I've still carried on with it and incorporated that and combined it with my textile background. And so I now just use natural dyes, because an ink and a dye are the same thing. It's just that they use for different purposes and different quantities. So I make colours out of ideally local and foraged and seasonal pieces, materials. Walnut is one that I'm really known for using, and I collect those every year. But I kind of try all sorts of different things, really, and play about with them. And there's a little bit of my practice. So I do a lot of teaching to do with ink making and natural dyeing, work with all sorts of different companies and do commercial dyeing and printing work for them, and do lots of teaching and workshops. Now, I'm not sure why that one's there. I think that's in the wrong place. But anyway, that's the road that I will be driving home on tomorrow, across from Deliver to Stay Little. And yeah, and that might crop up again at the end, because that's a really important image for what I'm thinking of doing. So I'm going to jump a little bit now to 4 years. God, I can't even remember how long ago it's now. I think it's 4 years ago, which is a good sign, when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I don't talk about this work very much, but it is quite integral to that previous idea of me talking about body and landscape and scarring. So after I'd finished the treatment of my breast cancer 3 years ago, I was given a month residency at an artist space in Cardiff called Made in Roath. And they didn't care what I did. They just gave me a space, because I hadn't really done anything creative. And people had asked me if I'd done anything, to do with my treatment. And I'd said no, because I hated it and I didn't want to do anything. And they gave me the space, and there was a healing well not very far from where the artist space was. And I was already interested in water and wells and natural dye healing properties and things. So I walked around that area quite slowly, because I wasn't feeling great, and gathered what I could. So I did kind of urban foraging, I guess, and collected water from that well and stored it in the gallery for that time, and used it as a space where people could come and just chat to me. And I had a couple of breast cancer sessions where, if people wanted to come and ask me questions about that. I learned to crochet with a friend of mine, and I taught people to do mending and did stitching, as well as creating inks from the area. So this is some of the work that I showed in that space. And it was kind of the first time I dealt with a lot of the issues to do with it. And it's only kind of now, talking about having to prepare for this, I can see the scarring issues and the skin as a landscape, and how we heal. And so I did a lot of hand stitching during my illness. And that dress, that sort of linen nightie on the right, is something that I hand stitched throughout the 8 months of my treatment. And then did some alteration of it after my surgery. And I cried a lot, not cried, but my eyes wept for months. So I used to carry around those little linen hankies to catch the drips from my eyes the whole time. And I printed that with healing plants. I also had little skull caps made for me by a friend, the one that taught me to crochet, and I dyed those with plants that have healing properties. So the one on the top is dyed with indigo. And the middle one I can't see from here and I've forgotten. And the bottom, I think no, I can't read the middle one. And the bottom one was what's really good for depression, evening primrose. Yeah, and then on the right hand side is a silk piece that I'd had made for me by somebody else when I was double-breasted, and then I altered it and cut the silk out and stitched it with willow, which is for pain, and some other plant dyes that are good for healing. And so those are some of the inks that I made at that time with things that I was able to gather from the spice shop that was next door to me, and things that people brought in and we had for lunch, or things that I managed to find on the streets. And that grid on the left, that sort of simplification and looking at just the colours is something that I'm really interested in. Jumping up to date, and the piece that you saw for this talk, which was the community quilt that I worked on last year. Oh God, year before. We're in 22, it's 2020. So I live in a place in North Cardiff where there's imminent development happening on a 23-acre wild meadow site. And 2 years ago, I became involved in the campaign to try and save that site. So that's the area of land that's there looking to develop. On the top right, that's me in front of the block of flats that I live in. It's a very deprived estate, or an estate that has people who have many issues in their lives and problems, and they don't have gardens. And so at the start of COVID, I had a grant from the Arts Council, and I also had a grant from Keep Wells Tidy to develop a community garden on that space. And at the bottom left, you can see a picture of the meadows, and there's a willow maiden on the left-hand side that we made to put up for the solstice. The irony is that the hospital that's being there is the cancer hospital that I was treated in. And they want to build their new site on this piece of land. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty emotive subject for people. So I've done a lot of screen printing and a lot of artwork for the project. So those are prints. I've done a lot of bunting and t-shirts, and that was a march that we arranged from the centre of Cardiff. At this time during lockdown, there was lots of other community artwork things happening. You know, people were going out, and there was lots of these little trails of rocks and things like that. And I became involved quite early on in the NHS campaign, to help the NHS by making bags for their scrubs. And my mum put a call out for fabrics, and that's the bags of fabrics that were delivered to my mum's house of all different bed linens and things. I started to do videos to show people how to make those bags and how to make their own masks and things. I was basically locked in my flat on my own, so I needed stuff to do. And the middle, no, this person second from the left on that left-hand picture is the community nurse that came and helped me when I'd had my surgery and emptied my drains and stuff. So it was really lovely to be able to do something for her. So this is actually over on the meadows, and it was my sanctuary really during lockdown. So I used to go and sit there along with many other people, walk there, cycle there, gather materials. And I started labelling the trees out on the site to get some kind of recognition for what was there, and give some interest for people that were discovering this place who hadn't really heard about it before. And that's some more of the artwork. So I was out and about screen printing on site with kids and printing t-shirts and banners. And the top two left ones are to do with XR. So I was working quite a lot with some of the XR people then who were bringing their stencils, and we made lots of banners and things like that. And that bottom left one is me and one of the other people who've been really involved in it. I guess it was about May time that I was investigating the site and looking at the history of the site, and I came across this tithe map from 1840 of the area, and it just made me think of a quilt. And I'm not a quilter, I'm not really a great stitcher either, but I just thought, okay, this could be a project I fancy doing. So I did a little watercolor of it first of all. And the tithe maps are great because they tell you who owned the land, what the land was used for, what the ancient name was, and really interestingly, there's lots of badly translated Welsh. So I was trying to find out what these names meant, and they didn't really mean anything. And then somebody contacted me and said, they're badly translated. So that's not actually what it was called. It was called this, but it's been anglicised in the documentation. So that was interesting. I collected lots of plants from the meadows and dyed lots of scraps of fabric up. And at this point, I thought, I'm not going to do this on my own. So I put a call out on some social media groups, local groups and things, and said, does anybody fancy doing this with me? And lots of people immediately said yes. So I had about 29 people that said they wanted to do it, mostly local to Cardiff. And so I delivered them packs. The top right there, you can see the little packs and the tied number. And they had a pattern and they had dyed fabrics and threads delivered to them, and they could do what they wanted. I didn't tell people what they had to do with it. It was up to them really. So you can see some of the fabrics and things that I sent out to people there. And the bottom right is me starting to join it together. So that's the finished quilt. So I hand stitched everything together. The surrounding pieces were dyed with acorns that were gathered from the meadows, and a real variety of people contributed to it. My daughter and my mum and a couple of friends are on there. Once I had the tithe map back in and joined all that together, I then cut through it. So that scarification, kind of cutting diagonally across it, is a railway cutting, and that was built in the late 19th century and is now, for the last 50 years, has been left, and it's a beautiful space that is naturally rewilded with lots of trees, and this is one of the pieces that they want to destroy. So again, is that kind of scarring happening across the landscape that's been rejoined. So I stitched through and quilted the roads and the canals and things like that. So that's kind of, and that's me recently in December, and the quilt was shown in the community hall on the estate. And 2 people from the estate took part, and one of them was a young man with 2 kids who hadn't stitched from school. And then there were quite established artists and textile artists, or a ceramic artist, various people like that took place. But it was lovely to show it actually on the estate, you know, where it was inspired. On the right-hand side, there is a piece that I did last year. I did lots of children's workshops based around the meadows, and we gathered plants and we printed and did cyanotypes, and then I brought all that together to make a digitally printed banner that was paid for by Cardiff Council, and it had the QR code for the Save the Meadows campaign on the bottom, which I just really liked, and they didn't realise. So they paid quite nicely for me to produce that piece of protest work. Moving on to kind of what I'm thinking about now, really. So that gives a history of what I'm interested in: landscape, I'm interested in industrial heritage and gathering these materials, particularly iron oxides and minerals and plant materials from the landscape. That's an old mine that is in the Gelfyddydol Valley, which I did some work around. So I mountain bike a lot, and then I gather and I photograph and maybe research some of the history, and that's part of the Owen Glyndwr Trail. These are pieces that were done for an exhibition with a tea company. So they're all dipped in various different types of tea and left as an installation to allow the dyes and the inks to absorb, and I would go in every week and alter them and move them, and they just create these accidental landscapes which remind me of the places that I visit. These are some natural prints, so eco prints, so they're the actual kind of essence of the, and you're capturing the actual organic compounds in the plant material by steaming them and wrapping them. And we did a piece yesterday, and I haven't done it, and I'm going to go and put it on the stove later because I've just remembered it's wrapped up somewhere and I haven't done it. And the bottom right is the little drawing using ink of the little wasp, the oatmeal wasp that creates those pieces. And that little piece of writing up there sort of resonated with me, that the processes I use and metaphors for nature's processes and things that naturally weather, create a surface. And so it's about experience of being in a particular place at a particular time, and an almost indescribable feeling of fragility and even vulnerability. And that's what I feel when I'm up amongst landscapes. So these are some of what I call ink test pieces and objects that I gather. So again, the process and the materials are really are part of the work. And you can see some of sort of ingredients, and I'm trying to learn Welsh. I need to learn Welsh, so I'm starting to kind of label my work in Welsh. And these are some pieces of, again, linen dipped into various different dyes and inks and creating what looked like kind of pen y fan landscape to me. A couple more there. I don't think you can see that, but I think that one might be about cabin crawl. You might be able to see it. I can't. It's on the bottom of the slide image. Can you see it on there? No, we can only see the thing. I can't see it. Yeah. So they sort of suggest particular places. I'm a kind of passionate rewild. It's a bit of an odd image, that, but I wanted to put it in to explain the imagining of rewilding places and the repair of damaged industrial landscapes is something that I want to look at for this project. So there I've superimposed a beech forest. That's a photo I think I took in Bratislava, where they have beautiful forests over the top of a Brecon Beacons landscape. But that's how those landscapes should look. They should have trees. They shouldn't be barren. And you know, rewilding is about a lot more. There's a lot of things to consider with it, but we should have more trees on our uplands. Again, that's another one. That's a landscape from Bratislava, superimposed over pen y fan, I think. I'm not sure exactly where it was. It's a little piece of work I did recently about mapping, and that's Blaenavon. And when you look closely at the contours around Blaenavon, around that town, they sort of just become a mess and blurred. And so I'm interested in the mapping of landscapes prior to the industry that happened there. And have they been remapped, and what's happened to the contours where there's coal tips and where there's quarries, and what happened if you shifted those around and put things back where they should have been, and just in a visual way, not actually in a physical rewilding way. So those have been done with my own inks overlaid over a map, and there's a little, it was done on an envelope actually, so there's a little window at the bottom where there's some of the Blaenavon iron oxide ochre contained that I gathered from the ponds that clean the old coal mine waters there. And I think that's it.